Good evening, everyone. It's not evening for some of you, but it is evening for the people who are technically the targeted audience of this particular stream. This is our EU stream timing, which you'll be seeing throughout the coming weeks. Though we don't expect these to be as common as our standard timing you'll see. Obviously, we are now playing Melty Blood. And, as you can see, we're basically beginners at Melty Blood. But it depends on what you think when you think beginner. It's hard to be a complete beginner at a game, even like this one, when you've already got so much experience with other games. Your understanding of what exactly you're doing and whether or not you're going to get away with certain moves, understanding of fighting games in general, and so on, all can get you through a lot more in a new game, even a game where it's as relatively complex as Melty can be. This is particularly true if you are focused on learning to play specific forms of neutral. And the game's requirement in terms of damage in combos isn't that high. This is true of a lot of these games, where the pressure game leads into relatively lower damage without meter, and you are better served in certain cases by being able to hit hard in neutral and actually do your whiff punishes. This is generally true because most people at the higher levels would quickly lose interest in a game that wasn't like this. But that doesn't mean we're able to stand up to pretty much anyone in terms of raw damage or in terms of the standard way the game is played at higher levels, so we still count as beginners. Understanding your options is still probably more important than anything else though, and we do work on that a lot across all the games we play. It's pushed down a lot also by the fact that there are so many mechanics in this game. By the time you've learned to focus your way through all of the actual things you must do just in neutral and normal play, you probably need to add another 6 layers of other stuff you need to be able to understand or recognize as happening. This is of course fun for players like us, but it can be really stressful when you face someone who's way better at it than you are. Still, you must be able to make the best of it whenever you can in terms of the amount of time you have to practice, and as multi-game people we don't really have a lot of options here sometimes. And of course in other things as well. One thing that definitely helps us in this game, however, is the sheer amount of fighting game experience translating into decision-making speed. So, if you are playing this sort of game and you feel like you're being overwhelmed, a lot of the time your problem is simply not having learned from other games to make decisions quickly enough to feel comfortable. We do in fact still intend to work on Melty bots, but the game was changing quite a lot, and the ways in which it changed made it difficult to be clear what bots should help you focus on. We do have some developed already. We do have some available already, I believe. But it took so long to understand what is the world of Melty finding important in terms of what you need to be able to do for this game to not feel stupid. And to be honest, even after the time I spent playing a lot of scouting, and purposely, of course, trying not to give too much of my own skill set building up in this case, I was basically trying not to get too good at the game otherwise. After all, we do have to think of content for people who don't have the same levels of decision-making speed and focus, and need to learn the reactions. So our Melty bots are in fact somewhat focused on that. You can basically practice your combos and punishes quote-unquote on your own time, or just as part of bots as a generality. Oof, so much armor. But to someone like me, this basically feels the same as always. I'm making decisions I would make in other games. I have the sorts of ranges I have in those games. And I die to supers when I shouldn't be pressuring, the same way as in all other games. Unfortunately, my scouting time has run out, more or less. If you're not familiar with this game, you are able to fight players up until the S rank, as long as you are D rank or higher. But if you're doing all that testing, you're not going to stay at even the D rank for long enough without being able to win. So you need to actually get all the combos and so on. Unfortunately for me, doing that would have changed the way that I was able to understand the game for others, and therefore, that combined with my tendency to be really, really aggressive against people who definitely don't want to deal with that, means that my rank is now E. Therefore, I'm no longer really capable of doing this because I don't think the game will pair me against the people that really teach me what I want to know. At least not without me learning a bunch of other things, though I think I gathered enough information already. So we will be developing more bots soon. This game in particular requires you to understand a relatively flexible form of combo theory. At least, if you want to be good in neutral, you must understand relatively flexible combo theory. This doesn't matter as much when you have characters who have relatively similar or easy to understand game plans, but I never have characters like that. I'm playing regular Arcwade in this game. So I'm back to the problem of having all the tools in the world and spending a lot of time learning them all. That said, that worked out relatively well. And we're going to be streaming again later tonight, and I'll probably talk more about that then. I'm not even sure of the current popularity of this game, so this stream might be almost entirely just the son and I duking it out. It's one of those games where things went up and down relatively quickly based on balance and overall outside perception of it. Because no matter how good the balance is, if you don't have the tools to understand what's happening, you can't really enjoy the game in the same way. Fortunately, so much of this game's actual combat flow when you're not in pressury situations comes from its universal mechanics. You get to try out characters a lot more easily. This actually also has a different downside though. It's one of those games where unfortunately balance has to be even tighter to satisfy the general interest level of most players. When a game has mostly standardish mechanics for all characters, and those are the things you need in order to get through your matches, once you've learned those mechanics, there's nothing really stopping you from just shifting to playing the whatever people consider to be the top tier character. This doesn't work for everyone, and there are characters where you are generally making a bigger leap than for others, but if your interest is specifically in winning the game rather than expressing yourself in some way, it gets much harder to justify not just using the best character. I am in that situation more so than most because I specifically have a even more top tier version of the same character, more or less. Her normals are often better, her movement is not necessarily better, but her ability to keep the opponent where she wants them is clearly better. I refer of course to Red Arcade, who is, I believe, still considered to be basically top-ish tier in this game. But while she does have a lot more power in most people's hands, I don't necessarily play this sort of game in order to win all that hard, as you can probably tell. And I have a specific way I like to play that I've built up over years and years of fighting games, so you're not likely to see a lot of switches to Red Arcade, even though I technically already play characters similar to her in other games and quite enjoy doing so. Mostly we play these games for enjoyment and somewhat flashiness. Games that have mass appeal and strong character bonds often lead to more focus, trying to get better overall at the game, and games that fail that, you'll end up just getting good at one character or trying to understand some other aspect of it. Particularly, issues of spacing, which comes up a lot more in this game than you might expect it to. The exact way that you can do your punishes, and which moves you can use for it, come up a lot. Understanding your opponent's exact position on screen seems to be one of the most important skills in this game. And the way that characters move changes it even beyond what you'd expect from Under Night. At least in Under Night you generally have a lot more control. Their moves tend to draw the opponent in more often or catch them in specific spaces. And through doing that, you're able to mostly keep things going the way you want them to for a long time, unless your opponent is so good at movement that you only ever land glancing blows. If you're playing this game at a really high level, it's a lot of glancing blows. And I know this because I've had the fortune of fighting against basically the strongest of the strong in the game already, at least the ones who are playing online. I can keep up with them better, which is the general /curse/ situation I find myself in. It's easier to handle high-level players because they're thinking about more things rather than knowledge checking you. But they're also sometimes just bored of not having that style of fighting happening. And they'll go a little easy at the beginning because they just want to have a more interesting match than they're used to. It is, however, useful that while a knowledge check is important, when a knowledge check becomes an execution check, when you basically can't stop what's happening because you don't know the timing for the punish or you don't know the situation that you're trying to avoid well enough to avoid it, things shift around a lot. But, just out of habit, higher level players are usually not going to repeat these too much once you've shown that you know how to get out of them. In short, proving that you can get away from this thing once will at least somewhat change the likelihood of those players doing the thing over and over again. This drastically changes most matches. So, don't get too discouraged if you're in that situation yourself, but I'll also tell you to judge what this game needs to be about and how much you care about it and how much you like it entirely by yourself. This is just me rambling to let you know there are people out there in the world who just want to play complex games. And there are people who don't. And you shouldn't necessarily feel anything specific, good or bad, about not being able to deal with people in the other camp. Either by winning or, in some cases, as mentioned on our Street Fighter stream yesterday, how those people make you feel to fight them. Because I have had it explained to me outright that for someone who's trying to do the same thing repeatedly and perfect it, fighting someone like me is really frustrating. I don't tend to give them the option to do the thing in the first place, and when I do, it often results in something they're not expecting. It's possible to win, in fact it's likely that they'll win, but it apparently isn't much fun to do. Which suits me just fine because it's not terribly fun for me to fight them either. That's gonna be blocked. No, you're not even blocked, worse. Burst straight through it all. But as far as that goes, I'm fairly random. I don't always do the sensible thing. I do the thing that I think. I'm not quite on the level of the meme people use for players who play characters slightly similar to mine. Wouldn't it be funny if it worked, though? A lot of the time I actually expect it to work because I just have that sort of knowledge tiled. When it doesn't work, I'm not necessarily surprised because it is, like, often slightly crazy. But I don't necessarily think to myself at any given point, I'm just gonna mess with my opponent by doing these things. And that's why I tend to play characters that have so many options for so many situations. I think I hit the wrong button there. I did. I haven't played this game in too long, really. But I think I would have got caught anyway, because that's just how that works. I also do actually have a plan for this matchup. I hit the wrong button again. I hope I don't have to switch those. That was better. At least I got it right that time. One of the things I did realize in that timing, and one of the things that comes up with my playing with the sun quite a lot, is that this game is full of accuracy checks. Understanding whether or not your attack is going to hit is probably the most important aspect of it. Your opponent can of course dodge out of it, and sometimes if they dodge out of it you'll be whiff punished fairly severely. But you can at least focus on whether or not you would hit if they didn't, because your opponent dodging is an active thing on their end. You're playing the Yomi, different things are happening. In this case though, I can't say that's what's going on all of the time. Knowing that you will or will not hit is probably more important than anything else. This is even more important because without that knowledge you can't fake out your opponent on anything. That basically counted as max range, I believe. Baited that in the wrong direction. Unfortunately for me, the more I play, the more involved and aggressive I get in various things. And, without even meaning to, the more I fight most people, the more defensive they get, simply because that's the correct thing to do. So sometimes I have to give myself some time to calm down and remember a lot of my win conditions involve specifically not hitting anything. But I'm not necessarily trying to win today. I'm hitting buttons. Relentlessness can in fact be an advantage. If you are good enough at keeping the life lead or playing neutral, and your opponent is not completely clear on all of your random craziness, absolute relentlessness can force them to use more resources than they might otherwise use, and having a confusing character to use for this means that they don't really have a lot of options directly. Your choices have to be great. Their choices basically aren't their choices at all at that point. It's just stuff is happening, and they're forced to pressure you sometimes. An opponent forced into a position of pressuring you so that you don't start whatever randomness you have in your mind is usually under a level of stress where they lose control of some of the stuff they're doing. Either because the character is limited in some way, or they just don't have enough understanding of which defenses actually work against whatever thing you're doing. If a player is, for example, used to being able to defend themselves by getting out of the way of an attack, and you, the player who actually have trained against this attack for offense purposes, have some confusing way through their regular defense, they may be stuck simply not having any answer at all. Or needing to use meter, needing to use something else that doesn't fit their normal model of play. Or needing to shield a lot, which you can definitely use against a lot of players in this game. That, for example, is technically a good thing. My opponent was more or less pushed down to the point of, I don't have any resources, I must use this for my defense. And while I'm not necessarily going to get any advantage out of that immediately, there's definitely stuff I can get. The mental capacity to switch up what you're doing based on the fact that your opponent doesn't have resources doesn't come up as much in this game as I expected it to, actually, but it is still important. But there you get the same concept. Even though I can be shielded, even though I can be damaged, my opponent doesn't have a lot of meter or some similar things to do a ton of damage from, so I can afford to just be relentless. Sometimes, you'll even see me do that, which isn't actually me not expecting it. That's me actually knowing that the good punishes from there don't matter to me, so I'm just going anyway. This also gives you more time to think about the way in which your opponent is being conditioned. Unfortunately, as you'd guess, this strategy only works if you have gotten to the point where your character is so confusing that it doesn't even matter. So I can't necessarily say that this is going to matter for a lot of people. I did forget to mention that these are generally going to be loser stays on. So we're seeing the same sort of thing even in these sorts of fights. Saber is a particularly good character to talk about relative to it because she has really good pressure under very specific situations. And her neutral definitely doesn't suffer, but a lot of it involves moving back and forth in ways that the opponent doesn't understand. I think that was why for a while she was considered a pretty bad character, simply because you can't beat people with Saber if the people understand Saber too well. Or rather, you can't dominate them. You have to play out the neutral, and you have to play it out relatively skillfully for anything to work out. Now, she does have the options to do this, and she converts quite well, especially if you don't spend a lot of time in the air or using air dashes. But opening people up with this character is actually kind of hard. She is technically a high-low character, but if you're fast enough, she's not that either. Against Koma it's more likely to work than against others because he doesn't really have a strong way to stop her air stuff that I'm not aware of anyway. He does end up shielding a lot of it and doesn't get great punishes off the shield either. But it's still something. Fortunately for Saber, she's fairly hard for Koma to actually attack, so she does get to play out that neutral a bit more cleanly. This is technically, as noted, an EU lounge, but I have no idea where the players here are from because, unlike Street Fighter, this game does not tell me. One of the counterintuitive things about this matchup is that Koma has to dash forward a lot, especially when Saber is on the attack. Mainly because, as you can see there, so much of her actual I'm being confusing and opening you up stuff involves jumping into the air over your head. And while Koma can't necessarily attack that position, he's really good at defending himself once he's gotten out of it. In fact, you can shut down many online Sabers entirely with nearly any character. As soon as she's knocked you down and you're expecting her to jump, because she pretty much has to jump, she's like the Ken of this game. Or more so the Kage, I guess, if you're a Street Fighter player. Yeah, just dash forward. And because she doesn't convert super well in neutral to big damage without meter, she has to get there. And there's the jump. It will always come as far as I can tell. I still need to study a lot more about this game, but from what I've seen and my general good understanding of this character, or characters like this in games, I'm going to bet she always has to jump. If she wants to open you up, she's going to jump. Because otherwise you can just sit there and block and everything will be fine. At the moment, we are in fact working on Saberbot. I don't think it's out yet, and I don't think it will be too soon, but it's definitely the same sort of thing that it's meant to teach you. It's meant to teach you, how can your character handle this? How can your character move through this situation altogether? And we have the same character from the same side. Now, unfortunately for me, Arcwade is even worse at this because her uppercut i.e. her defense, goes forward in a way that Saber just gets through or around altogether. You can avoid being hurt, so this is a lot of dashing around, but it doesn't actually turn out to be that much in the other respect. But, as you can see, that will generally still protect you. And that's the part of the protection you really care about. And all of this, while very dangerous, is still not a lot of damage. You can usually move between guarding low and getting ready for the position. This comes because of the proration aspect of these games. You'll notice that my opponent starts by hitting me with a lot of low A, 2A attacks. This results mostly in a reduction in their overall damage. And while it is very dangerous, if she lands them, you don't have to care that much in most situations. That was good damage, but it's not like crippling damage. And it requires the opponent to always be in a position to risk that happening to them. You also will learn from the bot to block that. Oh, I missed. The other reason, of course, you must learn to deal with that one is because of the exact thing I just mentioned. If she isn't jumping over your head on the knockdown, she doesn't have a lot of options, but that is one of them. She can start pressure and then go into that and hope for the execution check to work. Does this hit? I think it... no. Oh well. That was a fitting quote for the end of that. Oh yeah, babe, I'll show you some good stuff to eat. That's like the best thing you could do. It's easy to get overloaded in games like this when your strategy for dealing with different tools your opponent has are so complicated and the movement in the game is so much. There's a lot of speed and thinking involved in here to save your butt. Ooh. I should have expected that, given the mind space my opponent is probably in right now. You'll notice, for example, that they have not necessarily started running away from me, but definitely started moving a little slower, in terms of, are they willing to go for an attack in this space? See? Now, that's again the accuracy check aspect of this. Ooh, the cross-up. I could not get it in time. I did not expect that one to be a cross-up, actually, that's my fault. So yes, good play on that front. But, of course, that was a big conversion to get less than I expected. You can change whether or not your opponent's moves will actually be what they expect them to be in many situations as well. But that accuracy check failed me there. This one is also going to... No! I got it. I was trying to catch them at the beginning of their cycle of movement in the air. And I can't really be sure if I didn't just catch them on frame 1 of that movement. But it definitely was not an actual reaction, that was just me guessing. If anything, I'd say this player really has a good handle on how to play this character, like a really good handle on how to play them. But what they might need is their own accuracy to be raised a little bit. Because, as you can tell, their conversions are fine. Like, they know every single wave, every single path out of every single main thing. And that works out fine too, because I need the invincible one to get out of this situation, etc, etc. So, but you'll notice that they ended up being pushed down to, I'm going to hit 2A a lot. And that's a requirement that comes from that aspect of it. Not being able to make sure all of your hits land means that you have to turn back to focusing on punishes primarily, and hoping that your opponent doesn't have any misleading attacks that will cause you to attempt incorrect punishes. And of course, pressure execution checks. So it's a different style of thing that stops working the better you get. But we are back to this Sun versus Moon matchup, where you're likely to see a lot less of that. It's not that those tactics don't work on each other, in fact, quite the opposite. It's because our general goal is not to use things that we know work, but to use things we don't do well yet. Because it's hard to increase your reactions and decision making if you're trying to boil down the game to the simplest form possible. At some point, most players actually do need to learn, can I attack from here? Can I mislead my opponent from here? Can I do something different on their wake up that isn't just standard pressure and hope for the back and forth of it? But fortunately for most of those players, this doesn't come up for so long that you get a good foundation of the parts you need to win, especially against other people who don't have the same mindset as you, long before you actually have to worry about all the other things. Pushing on this aspect of it, however, is the standard that 2MK uses, simply because this is easier to learn within the team. This is the style that we mostly like to play, and you can practice combos on bots. This is the thing you can't practice on bots. Despite my efforts to make bots you can use this on, it's very difficult, and usually in any given game only one bot will come out in a way that will let you do that. And it isn't even consistent across all characters. Like, some characters can learn it and some characters can't, and I continually have to work on more advanced ones. Fortunately, if you're decently good at the game, at the combo part, at the execution, even if the bot becomes relatively complex and difficult to input, you won't be able to say, oh, I can't do this, because part of what's important is the randomness. It is the not knowing whether or not the bot will do exactly what you expect it to do. So if you input it incorrectly on any given day, given that our bots only work based on that, this game does not allow you to like keep bots. You have to input them every time. Comes up fairly often. I did get a lot of recovery out of that. That is a mechanic I'm fairly good with / familiar with. I tend to be a player in games like RPGs or whatever who thinks about when to heal and how to heal and uses healing techniques. Straight up healer in a lot of those types of games. So it's easy for me to think of, okay, well, I've reached this point, how can I safely cast Cure, Heal, Bless, whatever on myself? You can think of it as watching my MP. I'm used to doing this. Similarly, realizing I don't need to heal, I should use my MP for damage, let's say. One day we may also stream that sort of thing, but who knows? Our sabers both left. Oh well. It is true that most people are not expecting loser stays on lobbies, but it often does depend on whether or not you think that other people winning against other people doesn't necessarily make them better, so they're more likely to leave. So you could think about it that way. Still, if you've decided I'm logging on because I want to play this game and I want to get as much play as possible, I'd more so ask you why you, like, as an A player went into a room with a D and an E, but it is true that it doesn't always reflect on anything. It is possible to have players, as we often say in Street Fighter, the zero beasts who just don't care. The difficulty about that in this game is that functionally, it's much harder to be a quote-unquote zero beast in this game because it doesn't really have a marker that works like that. Generally, if you are lower ranked in this game, it's because you lost a lot of matches. And the question of why you lost a lot of matches? It could be that you were doing what I was doing, but that comes in both ways. There's the fact that I did that on purpose, but also the fact that I'm not good at this game. In short, it's harder to be a low rank in Melty Blood and it not be quote-unquote real. That's not a whiff punish. As for our other games that we're going to be streaming, it's pretty clear now that Under Night will be tomorrow, the Wednesday night in Birth stream. Some KOF on Feeling Thursday. And as clarified before, Friday will be for bots or nothing, depending on what we're doing that day and whether or not the local is playing. Okay, and as mentioned before, we're back to the point where I have to spend a lot more time making sure to think about the shielding that's going to be happening. I am drifting back into attacking despite it. We're getting close to the end of stream though, so as I said before, I'll probably do that later. For now, I'm just gonna hit buttons. I can, of course, resolve this a bit more by controlling neutral more than I've been. But it doesn't make sense to do that if the main flow is around playing neutral as a whole. What I really need to do probably is use more of my moon meter, since my opponent is using theirs as a partial defense mechanism. At the very least, it'll give me more meter to do other stuff with. The one thing you can generally do in that situation if you find yourself being shielded too much and feeling like you're not thinking through your moves enough is to throw more, simply because it's still an attacking stance mentally. This also will change your opponent's behavior to thinking about the throw, which means that the other aspects of your attacking stance probably go back to being more effective at least. Throws are very short range and don't tend to stop an opponent from doing anything, especially if it's a longer range move or something that comes in as an approach from the air. So if your character relies a lot on that and you find yourself being shielded in those cases, you might want to attempt more throws simply to put the throw in your opponent's mind more often, which will open back up the way you were standardly playing before, and you can think less about it. This is particularly helpful if you have an opponent who tends to backdash out of bad situations, because the whiff punish of a throw in most games is not the sort of thing you have to worry about when opponent have backdashed away. There's other moves you could use that would put you in bad situations, but throwing someone, whiffing a throw, even in this game where the whiff moves you forward, depending on the timing of their backdash, you'll attempt the throw before they've moved too much, and this will cause your character to not necessarily advance. Throws are, however, unfortunately one of the highest accuracy checks in the game. So don't expect a lot from that in that regard. I have another combo, but I don't remember it right now. That one is thankfully very confusing to a lot of opponents online at the level I ended up playing at. And I don't necessarily mean like the low level ones. The higher level players had more trouble simply because they're used to being pressured in grounded situations. Jumped forward too much there. Working out your air control is probably the next most important thing. But you shouldn't spend too much time on this unless you're playing characters like maids or, well, either maid and the combination of maids. Even Red Archway doesn't need it that much because the amount of air control you have has a lot to do with the momentum options your moves give you with the air. If your moves always basically go the same place and are only changed by at what height you activated them, you're not necessarily going to get a lot out of learning your air control options. One of the greatest things about Koma using that power through style option is that he does not actually get into throw range after it, and he almost always can hit something right then. So you can't deal with the fact that he has armored up by using something that's going to beat the armor under most circumstances. You could set up situations like that, but you can't backdash out either. So overall, it's a generally good way to deal with people who don't have any reason to stop attacking. It's a different way to end up using a lot of his meter, but that's the point of the move. It's not that there is no difficulty or no answer to it, it's that the answer doesn't work if you're in the attacking mind state at the time. Because he does not in fact care that much about even the hit he takes from being shielded, which helps a lot. It is possible to get fatal counters, but from that position he really doesn't need to hit anything that would allow you to get them. Footsies. We're actually slightly over time, but that's fine. The stream will be ending after this final match of this set though. But most likely, I'll be back in around 7 hours. Of course, for the EU community, who is technically who this stream is for, most of you will be in bed then. I'll do a better check on which bots we have available and which ones are probably going to stay around. That was a new thing I have to learn now. But I'll continue our stream, or rather end our stream by basking in the awesomeness of my character. And with that explosive finish, we've come to the end of our stream. This has been Rillian, 14 2MK. I'll catch you later.